thank you all so much for coming out, for being the folks that are going to stick it out through the rest of the course. I'm so excited to share with you the research that Loma and I have been doing and our general knowledge and passion for the birds that have brought us all here tonight, which is corvids, and crows specifically. So, normally when I do this talk, I have to start with some of the really general, basic background of these birds. But that would be old hat to you guys. You guys have been in this class for a few weeks now, you know a lot of that stuff. So I want to start with something a little different. I'm going to give you guys a little quiz and sort of see, what you've been learning as you've been going on. So let's start with a really basic question. We've got 4 birds up here, and one of them is not like the other. One of these is not a corvid. So I can either do a poll and have hand raising, or if someone wants to just put it out there and make their guess, I'd be happy to. Okay, so how many people, let's do this. How many people raise your hand think it's the Australian magpie?
11.
No. Okay. Gray tree-back?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thick-billed raven and red-billed chalk. So, you all, I can say for sure, you will all be very surprised to learn it's the Australian magpie. I know, I got you. So, yeah. So I see tons of videos because these birds are incredibly charismatic and they're very closely related to corvids. I see a ton of these videos floating around online and people applauding the magnificence of corvids, which they should always be doing. But in this case, it's not quite accurate because this is actually part of the butcherbird family, or Timidaes. And, but like I said, this is very closely related. We suspect that corvids probably radiated out from Australia, and so this is some of our early birds. But in fact, not a corvid. In terms of some of the other birds, this one in particular is native to areas of Southeast Asia, and this one is Europe and Asia again. Thick-billed ravens, you can find them in Africa, and then of course Australian magpie is in Australia. And just one more sort of fun fact to put in your back pocket, the thick-billed raven is the largest songbird in the world. So this bird weighs in at almost 3.5 pounds, and from nose to tail, so to speak, it's about 2.5 feet long. So this is an incredibly powerful bird for a songbird. All right, so how many species of corvid are there throughout the world? Apparently there's pressure. Mary told me you guys should know this.
Oh boy.
There you go, yeah, 120. And of those, how many of them are listed as threatened or endangered?
They didn't tell us that. 35. 22. 12.
Yeah. So 22 actually, there's quite a number. Some of the ones that you may have heard something about before is the the Hawaiian crow, the alala. So that bird is actually officially extinct in the wild, but there are several breeding programs, notably in San Diego, and it seems like the word is they expect to release some of these birds into the wild within the next year. So we can be hopeful that that happens. And then of course another one that may be familiar to you is the Mariana crow, which is a native species to the island chain of Guam. They were extirpated on Guam by the brown tree snake, but they still have a population out on Rota. It is declining, we're worried about it, but there are no brown tree snakes there. So it's a really interesting, the story of that particular bird is especially interesting because like I said, there aren't these invasive tree snakes. And so the question of why, we know that they're experiencing habitat loss, we know that they're experiencing human persecution, but really the details of what's driving their population decline is much muddier than we think. There's another graduate student who doesn't work in our lab, she's over in psych with the Haas, but she does her research on this, and it's a fascinating story. I really hope that she publishes this soon. In a nutshell, they think that, so when we were occupying it, not that we don't still now, but when we had more military personnel, we introduced this big land snail. And then we went, uh-oh, that was a mistake. We have this big invasive species, because there are native both land and sea snails there. And Excuse me. So once we realized what a mistake we had made introducing this snail, we're like, okay, we got to get rid of this. So we did what is usually always a terrible idea in the history of ecology, and we introduced yet another invasive species to deal with this. But it actually worked really well. Completely got rid of this invasive land snail. Now the other organism that lives on Mariana is the hermit crab. And most corvids cannot tackle hermit crabs. And the reason for that, especially on Rota, is because the shells of the native snails that they're using are very, very hard. So the birds just can't crack these babies open. But this invasive snail shell, which now there's an abundance of, right, because we've killed all of their inhabitants, are really thin. And so it seems like this is actually a great story. We dealt with this invasive species, and we made it way easier for hermit crabs to get into these shells, and because they're thinner, these crows actually know how to crack them open, and they don't drop them from up high like most birds would. They actually peck at the seams of the shell until they can break off the top and then just extract the crab. So it seems like a great story. But what her research is showing is because they're spending all of this extra time now on the ground trying to tackle these hermit crabs, because they only do this special extraction on the ground, they don't fly them up into trees, that they're getting attacked by feral cats. So it's one of those stories that sort of reminds us of the complex weaves of ecological disaster we are capable of weaving as human beings. But anyways, so the take-home message is people tend to think of crows as being really ubiquitous. I mean, of course, when we look at crows in the city or even ravens, they are all around. We're very fortunate. But there are many areas around the world where that's not true. And the main theme with those types of places is they're usually always island species, because island species, be they corvids or lizards or whatever, are almost always much more sensitive, and of course their starting populations are much smaller. Okay, so this is a big question I get asked a lot. Can you get West Nile virus from touching a dead crow? If you find one in your yard and you pick it up and that crow's infected, do you need to worry about getting this virus? What do you guys think?
Only if you lick it. No.
Well, no, I heard a good bold no. So yeah, no. There is no evidence, according to the CDC, that there has ever been. It really would be very easy to transfer this virus from the body of a deceased organism, be it a crow or some other kind of bird, to a human being. So rest easy. This particular disease requires a vector, and that's mosquitoes, to be transferred. So if you want to deal with West Nile virus, you don't need to deal with corvids, you need to deal with mosquitoes. And last question before we move on. I know last week you had your mythology course. I'm hoping Mary didn't cover this. Why are ravens kept at the Tower of London? So is it to remind of the deaths that occurred there, to keep the rats at bay, to protect the crown and the tower, or as a simple tourist attraction? Yeah, so it seems like most of you know this one. So yeah, to protect the crown, and probably a little bit now, number 4 too. So the story of how this came to be is a little bit esoteric. They think the best guess and the most consistent answer people give is that it was Charles II. And the myth, the legend, so to speak, is basically if there aren't 6 crows at the tower, the crown will fall. And so, being very pragmatic, the Brits always keep 7 so that they have a spare. So, you know, just in case something happens to them, we wouldn't want to risk that. And I think one of my favorite stories is, you know, obviously these crows are very intimately tied to their handlers. And as you guys may have covered in another course, most corvids are excellent mimics. They're very good at mimicking human voice. And some of these ravens have taken after the tour guides at the Tower of London and remind visitors to keep to the path in case they go straight wandering off.
I told them the story of Bram, of the Welsh giant that had his head cut off. Or when he died, he said, please cut my head off and bury it under the Tower of London in order to protect the tower. And the tower didn't exist then. So it probably is a made-up story.
Well, that is not one that I'm familiar with, so you'll have to tell me more about that afterward. So with that, I want to transition to the way Loma and I are going to to do this talk is we want to start by just giving you some of the generals that make us really excited about these species. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to talk to you about how it is, what are all the things that got me interested in wanting to dedicate my life to researching these animals. And then I'll pass it off to Loma. He'll do the same. He'll go over his research. And I'm going to sort of bookend tonight. So we'll finish with my specific research looking at how they respond to dead crows. So with that, I wanted to start with, I think, one of the most charismatic parts of their behavior, because it's one of the things we as human beings can really relate to. And that's the sort of family lives of these organisms. So crows are socially monogamous. Does anyone know what I mean when I say that? Yeah.
It means that they may mate with others, but they formate with their parent pair.
Exactly. So they have a tight pair bond that they'll maintain for life. Divorce does happen, but it's fairly rare. And they maintain that for breeding and social reasons, but there's also a little extra stuff that happens off to the side. We don't know for sure, but it seems that most of that is not solicited by the female. Yeah, so there are some, yeah. We tend to sort of romanticize these birds, and definitely there's things that happen there that, you know, they're animals just like we are. So again, these birds form tight pair bonds. They can live to be anywhere between 15 and 17 would be a pretty old crow in the wild. It certainly happens. I think in captivity, the oldest captive crow lived to be maybe 30-ish. I'd have to double check that. But these are very long-lived birds, and these bonds are incredibly tight. So the other interesting things that crows and other corvids engage in, as well as many other birds, is something called cooperative breeding. So that's basically where you have your mated pair, and they're being assisted by, most of the time, sons or daughters, and sometimes it can even be a non-related floater. But there's basically extra birds at the nest sort of helping out. And I use those air quotes because when we actually look at the data, they're not very helpful. It's sort of this weird mystery in birds where there's this clear cost to the parents, because it's basically this extra mouth to feed, it's this extra bird taking up resources on their territory, and they don't seem to really be doing a whole lot. And we've seen this in lots and lots of birds. Nuthatches are another example that I can think of off the top of my head, where the motivations for this seem unclear. Now, the motivations for the helper are very clear, because frankly, it can be a breeding opportunity for that female, even if it's a first son. So that happens. It's rare, but it definitely happens. If it's a floater male, again, definitely a potential breeding opportunity. They have, you know, the security offered by basically these two watchful birds. They're territory holders, so they're going to be defending that. You sort of get under that umbrella of protection. But the benefits to the mated pair are a little bit unclear. So if this hasn't been borne out in our American population, but in Spain, the species there is what's called the carrion crow. And they looked at this. In fact, carrion crows have much more consistent and bigger family sizes than our American crows do here. So it's a little bit more of a compelling question there. And they did this really interesting experiment where they said, okay, so on the surface, it doesn't really seem like our helper birds do much. But what if we handicap the parents somehow? So they did this experiment where they did just that. They basically clipped the wings of the adults. They make them way less able to assist in any part of the breeding, you know, their duties as parents. And I should also say that in addition to the fact that helpers aren't super helpful, there's actually a spectrum within helpers. So scientifically, we refer to the worst of them as lazy helpers. That is the word. And so there's lazy helpers, and then there's really good helpers. And what they found was when they handicapped those parents, it was actually the lazy helpers that compensated the most to make up for that loss. So at the hurt of my own generation, I sometimes like to compare it to millennials. It's not that we're lazy or just trying to stay at home, but when we're really needed, we're going to rise to the level and come to the rescue. So you just got to be patient. So who here has ever had this experience? You're walking along, you love crows, and you're attacked by one, and it feels really unfair, and you don't know why it happened. Why are they teasing you? Has this ever happened to anybody here? So some of you, and this happens a lot in the city of Seattle. In fact, there are warnings that get put out in local media every about mid-June, July, putting people on the alert that they may be attacked by a crow. So I'm guessing this is not new information to you, so I'll ask the question, why does this happen in June and July? Yeah, exactly. So as I hope is clear to you now, these birds are very, I'm going to use sort of an anthropomorphic term and say they're very family oriented, right? So their kids will stick around for a year or more. They're fierce parents. And so every summer there's this sort of heat of antagonism towards these birds and vitriol because people don't understand why they're being attacked. It feels very unfair and it feels like, why do I have to deal with this crappy wildlife that's getting up in my face and I'm not doing anything wrong? And the answer is, well, these birds are trying to be excellent parents. So around that time, crows, like many birds, their babies actually leave the nest before they're completely flighted. That is a totally normal thing. So if you see a fledgling crow or a fledgling jay or robin in your yard and it's running around and it's healthy, but it can't fly, that bird does not need to be rescued. It is in the care of its parents, and it's much better if you leave it there. But what can happen is that bird is running around, it runs under a bush and you don't see it, and you're walking down the sidewalk, but the parent knows it's there. And it sees you, you're a big, powerful animal, you're walking towards its young, and it's going to defend that, it's going to defend its offspring. And so that is exactly why we see these kinds of attacks tick up in the breeding season. The one other case where I see this is, I've definitely had this experience. If you regularly feed crows, if you do anything regularly enough and interact with enough animals, you'll start to notice outliers. Crows have personalities, and there are different crows. And sometimes they can just be aggressive as heck. I have one crow by my house. I fed, as part of an experiment, 7 days. After 7 days now, unfortunately, when I walk to the grocery store, which is across the street from my house, it will actually come down and dive bomb me and occasionally hit me in the head, asking for peanuts. So that's the one other context I've seen this behavior, but most often this is just a simple offspring defense. Okay, how many folks here, I'm sure all of you know what this image is from? Good. Sometimes when I give this to younger audiences, they look at me with blank faces and it makes me feel so, yeah, I'm just like, dude, how do you know this is a classic movie? So anyway, so this image, yes, it's iconic, it's from Hitchcock's The Bird, which is a great film as far as horror movies go, but despite his known reverence for these animals, I think he did them a humongous disservice by creating this sense of creepiness and anxiety and fear when we see a lot of them gathered together, right? And one reason why this has been so powerfully negative for these birds is they do something called communal roosting. So a few miles north of where I live in Kirkland, which is do you guys know the Seattle area? Okay, so I don't have to say. So I live in Kirkland. A few miles north is a satellite campus for the UW at the UW Bothell. And if you go there at this time of year, if you go there at about 5:30 or 6, you will see this. Maybe. I should say these are all crows.
Oh my God.
Loma can speak to this more after the presentation if any of you have questions, but so he did some work up there, And his best estimate is every night, especially in the fall and winter, there are about 12,000 crows that come to the University of Bothell. There's a riparian area behind campus to roost. And again, just like your fledglings leaving before they're completely flighted, this is actually pretty common behavior among birds. And basically, despite the fact that crows are territory holders during the day, so they're mated pairs, they have a home turf, so to speak, and they occupy that territory all year round, at night, they all come to the same place to sleep. And like so many aspects of these animals' behavior, we can give sort of a reasonable explanation, but when we're pressed on the details for why they do something, most of the time we just go, oh, I don't know. So communal roosting is one of those things. So it's been proposed for a number, as filling a number of roles. So anti-predator behavior is a big one. Crows' main predators, especially in the city where we live, are things like red-tailed hawks, Cooper's hawks, great horned owls, and then potentially things like raccoons and of course cats. And so sleeping in a big group like this, there's safety in numbers, right? This is a very familiar concept. And so they all go to these places, and we think that they prefer these riparian areas. So you can see these de-leafed willow trees. And so there's some other, like, so not aspen, it'll come to me in a minute, but alder. And basically, what you have are these thin interlocking branches. And the idea is if a predator in the middle of the night tried to penetrate that, those branches are going to rattle. The crows near it are going to hear it, and then they can send an alert to the rest of the community. The other explanation, and of course these things don't have to be mutually exclusive, is information centers. So maybe the reason that crows get together and ravens get together in these big groups is that they're learning something. And in ravens, the support of roosting information centers is more supported than we found it to be in crows. That was actually some of John Marslow's earliest work, was looking at roosts as mobile information centers. And they were able to get some support for basically if they had a non-territorial raven, and they had it captive, and they released it at a food site that they had put out, so you get a dead deer carcass basically, and you release this raven there. It'll fly back to the roost at night, and then in the morning, it'll bring other birds there. Now, that only happened, I believe, 3 out of 20 times, so it's not a super, in my opinion, it's not a super strong connection, but there are other studies that have shown this as well. Now, in crows, we don't see this information center playing out as much, and one of the really interesting things is mated pairs don't necessarily roost together. So Loma was actually describing this observation to me of getting out to a territory really early in the morning, and one bird is there, and it seems like it's waiting for its mate to join it. And that is very real, because in fact, when they've done experiments monitoring birds that either have a radio tag, or this is my favorite version, they put out a carcass and they load it with plastic beads. So when they're eating the meat, they ingest these plastic beads, and at the end of the night, they regurgitate them in pellets. And the next day you just go to the floor and you go, there's all the red ones, there's all the blue ones, and that gives you a sense of where the birds were coming from that roosted at different parts. But anyway, so there is some mystery about why crows do this. Certainly predator learning, it's warmer, but there's got to be more going on, and so there's so much left that we need to discover about the function of these particular organizations. So from a personal standpoint, when I was an undergrad in college and I was thinking about what do I want to do, I know I love animal behavior. I'm really interested in the social intelligence hypothesis, which is basically that being social is really hard, and it sort of makes you smarter to be able to navigate all of the pitfalls of what it means to have these complex relationships. I started reading about crows and ravens, and I was just fascinated by how they were becoming a model to answer this question. And I think one of the earliest moments of really appreciating what corvids were capable of was this video. And I'm hoping, has everybody seen this? No? Good. Okay, great. Prepare to just be dazzled. So this is, oh, and I should preface this, so this bird's name is Betty, and she's a New Caledonian crow, and New Caledonia is an island off the coast of New Zealand. And unlike many of their island counterparts, New Caledonian crows are doing just fine. They have a very healthy population. And these are very special corvids because they are one of the only corvids in the wild that have been documented to use tools. So on New Caledonia, there are no woodpeckers. And the lack of woodpeckers means that there are big grubs and other insects hiding under the bark or hiding in logs that aren't being exploited. And so New Caledonian crows, they're the ones exploiting this niche. But they don't have big, powerful bills to hammer into the wood like a woodpecker. So they have to sort of manufacture that. And so in New Caledonia, there's a plant called the pandanus plant, which have these really rigid leaves with serrated edges. And what people notice is these crows tear off the sort of edge of these leaves with these serrated edges, and then they use those to poke it into things. The insects catch on those edges, and they can pull them out and eat them. So we knew that these crows, you know, they tear off leaves to make tools. So in this experiment, Betty had a cage mate, and they were given a hook, which they also use, and a straight piece of wire. And it was a very simple experiment. They just wanted to show that they knew to get this in this cylinder's little bucket. It has a piece of food in it. They just wanted to show that the birds knew which was the right tool to use. So it's a pretty straightforward experiment. Unfortunately, Betty's cage mate took off with her hook. So she's trying to use this straight piece of wire, which she always did, and it's not working. And the researchers go, damn it, like the experiment is ruined because he took off with it, and we can't figure out what Betty's going to do. And so she's poking at it, you know, and she goes, I have an idea. So Betty has no experience with a pliable wire like this. There you go. So this was one of the first videos that just made me go, wow. Like this is an ant. She, like I said, she had no prior experience with wire. She had had some experience just being able to play in free play. It's what they call it with like pipe cleaners. But this was totally Betty saying, I have this object. I know what it takes to get it out of this tube. Or I should say it appeared that this is sort of her thought process. And so I'm going to bend this into what I need it to be. So tool use in birds, I mean, that's just, it blew me away as somebody sort of new to the study of animal behavior and animal intelligence. So when I talk about animal intelligence, I think a really valid question, a common one is like, what does it mean for an animal to be smart? Like, how do we possibly measure that? Any animal is very well adapted to whatever its niche is. Isn't that a form of intelligence, that it's successful? But when we're talking about this kind of intelligence, we're really talking about these different, what we call the cognitive toolkit. So these are the main ways that we measure intelligence in things like parrots and primates and children and corvids. And the main things we're looking for is what's called causal reasoning, so cause and effect. Flexibility, so are you going to do the same thing every time, or can you respond if you're thrown a curveball, like Betty did? Imagination, so can you envision things that aren't immediately happening? And then prospection, so can you reflect on the past to plan for the future? And so I love to use this example. Nico Tinbergen, which was one of the founders really of animal behavior study, his book, The Herringbold's World, he tells this story of gulls will drop clamshells from high up to try and crack them, that's great. That could maybe, seems like maybe a form of tool use. It's not by our scientific definition, but it seems smart. The problem is a gull will drop the clam onto soft sand or water as many times as it will drop it into pavement. Because the key question when we're asking this intelligence question is, do they actually understand how it works? So a gull can drop it on pavement and it works and that seems really smart, but if it doesn't actually understand that it needs to drop it on pavement versus sand, then that's not reaching sort of this cognitive level that we might deem as sort of intelligence. And so when Betty did this, like I said, these are birds that know, they use hooks. It was pretty amazing that she was able to use this novel object, but again, like, there's some question, she was the only crow that they ever saw do this, so there's some question of, do they really understand what's happening? So more recently, some scientists, again working with New Caledonian crows, wanted to test out the Aesop's fable. And is this a familiar story to you, the story of the crow and the pitcher?
Yes.
So yeah, so basically there was a pitcher of water, the water level was too low, so the story is a crow dropped stones in it so that it would raise the water level and it could drink. So some scientists really wanted to test this out. And the function of that was really looking at, do they understand causal reasoning? So I'm going to play you a video. I won't talk through it because there's some text at the bottom of the screen that I think does a really good job of walking you through it, and then we'll talk about it when it's over. We need the charger for your computer. Oh. So what do these tests, a variety of tests that they did, tell us? So it tells us that crows excel when they can use sort of familiar cause and effect concepts. So the things that they did really well at was knowing that they needed to use solid instead of hollow objects to raise the water, objects that sank rather than floated, and that water was going to make this work, but sand wasn't. And these are all things that theoretically a crow could have experienced at some point in its life. And these are all of the tests that 5 to 7-year-old people, that's sort of the age that they really grasp onto these things. So, I mean, that in itself is really impressive. And I should also say that, so just as sort of a preface, these birds were trained to drop stones. So they had experience doing that. Dropping stones is not something that they do in the wild, but they were given some training on dropping stones to move a platform. So they had some experience doing that, but they had never been given the experience of doing it in water. So that is really spontaneous. And they found that most of the crows they tested, it was 6, were able to successfully complete all of these tasks. Now where they got tripped up, as you saw in the video, was basically counterintuitive tests. So the width of the tube, understanding that it would be easier and faster to work with the more narrow tube versus the wider tube, they didn't quite catch on to that, and maybe that's just because, you know, either way they were going to get fed, and they're not super food deprived, so there's not a huge motivation to go with the more efficient way. Maybe that's why. And then the other thing that they just completely failed at was that U-test, where basically you had a tube of water and you were dropping the stones in one area and that was having an effect somewhere else. And that, as human beings, we're able to accomplish those tasks at around 8. But the crows were totally stumped there. And I should say that most of these other tests, chimps are really bad at, actually, surprisingly bad at. So crows are really good at some things, and the reason why we ask these questions, we spend a huge number of hours, we spend money trying to address, you know, because somebody could legitimately ask, I don't really care that a New Caledonian crow is good at problem solving. Like, why does that matter? And the answer is, it's amazing that an animal so distantly related to us as humans possesses a lot of the same capabilities. And understanding when they fail and when they succeed tells us a lot about our own evolution as human beings and about animal cognition. So there's really big picture implications to understanding the limits of what these birds are good at and what they're not so good at. So I just got a few more things before I hand it over to Loma. This, again, is one of those charismatic things I think just really makes people love crows. There's a lot of people out there that just hate corvids and they can't deal with them. You know, but show them one of these videos and I think you'd be hard-pressed to see someone just frowning the whole time. So this is a hooded crow. This is native to Russia. And it's got this lid right here. And the video quality is a little bad, I apologize. But it's got this lid, and it's got this sort of snowy bank. And it's up at the top. And so here's the causal reasoning. It's not on snow right there, so maybe 1 point sort of off from the crows because it didn't quite understand that it needed to be on snow. But still, I think this video is just amazing. I ended too early. So I think it might try one more time, but you get the picture. So it seems pretty clear. I mean, you might be able to make the argument that it was just pecking on the lid because it might have thought food was underneath. A lot of times the lid conceal food. But it really seems like that animal is playing. So I did some research into this, and there's only about 25 species of bird that have ever been documented to play. And the definition of play, I should have written it down because it's long and filled with jargon and kind of boring, but it's basically activities that have no immediate benefit to the playee, and we can't see any reason that they're doing it in long or short term. And so it's basically things that they do that don't seem to be beneficial. They're not getting food, they're not any of that. And so it's really amazing and a wonderful opportunity that crows and ravens, which we've observed doing this a lot, especially ravens out here where you have snow, that kind of snow play is really prevalent among corvids. It's really cool that we get to see that if you pay close attention. There are 7 kinds of documented play. And so those include things like object play, sliding, hanging. So this is another one. There's a video going around right now on social media I've seen of those Australian magpies, and there's 2 of them. And one of them is hanging, so that is a really classic play behavior. There's vocal play. So at the end of summer, you might hear baby magpies or crows sitting in the tree just making all kinds of sounds. And they're just sort of playing around, just like we do as young children with like all of the sounds we can make with our mouths. And so when we observe these behaviors, we always ask what I think is the obvious question of, why do animals play? And does anybody want to venture what they've learned or what they think? So, what?
Have fun.
Have fun? Okay, maybe. So when I was in high school, I always remember the classic answer being, well, animals play to practice skills that they need for life. So when you're doing the string and the cat's pouncing on it, it's practicing how to hunt. And when we see puppies wrestling, they're practicing how to be better fighters. And that makes so much sense, and it's totally wrong. It's really weird. So we've done many, many experiments, mostly mammals, where over and over again we find that animals who are deprived of play are no less social as adults, they're no less capable of hunting, they're not worse fighters. All of these measurements that seem like obvious consequences to playing are not coming to fruition in adulthood. That being said, they do tend to do better overall. Their fitness is better. They live longer, they have more successful offspring, and so it does seem to be benefiting them in some way. And so the best answer researchers have right now, and there's a great piece in Scientific American about it, is basically that play is a way to practice stress so that animals are better at dealing with it. We are by no means the only animals that have to deal with a certain amount of stress. And so when we play really intense games, it's a very sort of low-risk way to have you get all heated up and then be able to deal with that effectively. And so they think that that's one of the functions play might be playing in an animal's life. It makes them more effective at dealing with stress, and stress, as many of us know, can really be pretty deadly. So I'm going to end on this note, because this transitions really nicely to what Loma's going to talk about. I think the very last part of these animals that is so charismatic, and really as a young student made me want to study them, is this clear human connection. So I'm just going to leave it with this incredible story. If you read In the Company of Crows and Ravens by John Marsliff, he talks about this. But basically, there was a guy out in Seattle, and like so many people, he would feed the crows every day. He had a platform in his backyard, and one day, he's just feeling a little cross, and he goes out there and he says, "Every day I bring you this food, and you don't ever bring me anything." And he goes inside, and then he comes out, and all the food's gone. But there is this purple candy Valentine heart, those horrible cornstarch hearts you get during Valentine's Day, and it says love on it. And he goes, "What?" So he sends John Marsliff an email and relates this story. And John was maybe a little bit wary, but he decides to pursue this, to go. And so he goes out and met with this guy with sort of the following different hypotheses. So maybe crows understand oral and written human language. And that seems like the least likely, but maybe. Maybe this guy is just making it up because he wants the attention. Maybe somebody played a prank on him. And so John wanted to explore these possibilities. And after meeting with this guy and talking to him, it was very clear that he was not trying to pull John's leg. He really believed that this is happening to him. John interviewed his wife and his neighbors, and it didn't seem like their kids were long out of the house. His wife actually wasn't very mobile, so for her to do this in such a short period of time would be hard. And his neighbors hated this. They hated that he fed the crows. So they're not very interested in fostering this really nice, heartwarming story. And so there's this question of, crows clearly have this connection to us as human beings, and they do sometimes really inexplicable things, and gift giving is one of those things. But I think exploring all of the ways that they're paying attention to us in ways that we might not even be to them is one of the sort of most interesting and inspiring things to me as a researcher for why I want to study these animals. So with that, I will turn it over to Loma, and he's going to go into all of that science that we've been doing, and then, like I said, I will finish with my own research.
All right, well, thank you all for coming. My name is Loma. It's kind of a hard name to remember. It's Cherokee, actually, but I have a mnemonic device to help you remember, which is actually totally true. I am Loma from Oklahoma. So my portion of this talk is going to be to... I've done something terrible. Back up. My portion of this talk is to discuss the most recent research that we've done in the Marsliff Lab. And when I say we, I mean some people else in the Marsliff Lab, because I've only been here for 2 years. I'll end with talking about my own research, but we'll take a break before then. So what I'm going to go over is our studies on the human facial recognition by crows, how they can judge our intentions by using different cues on our face, and how they learn that some animals that look like predators are actually quite benign. So let me start off by going into our human facial recognition study. This is probably the most famous study that we've done. It's our lab's claim to fame. And you guys probably have already heard of it. I'm going to go into a bit more detail. So we started banding crows all across Seattle starting around 1997. And John noticed that after he and his crew caught the crows in an area, whenever they came back, the crows seemed to scold them. And it just seemed like, are they scolding us specifically, or are they just upset at people because they've been grabbed and handled by people and they're just scolding anybody? So John decided to set up an experiment to test whether or not they're scolding the people who grabbed them or just anybody. So the first thing they did is they tested, can crows recognize an extraordinary face? So John went out and got this very distinct caveman mask, and he would wear this caveman mask, he and others would wear it whenever they would catch crows. Now, it's important that we have another second mask to make sure that the crows aren't scolding just masked people. They're actually going after a very specific mask. So we got a second neutral mask. This guy. Now, even though your average Seattleite would be very unnerved by this mask, the crows had no reason to fear him. We never wore Cheney when we caught crows. Personally, I actually feel this is a missed opportunity to get the crows to mob politicians, but that's a different story. So we caught the crows wearing the caveman mask, and we also had them wear a hat, which I will go into in a little bit. We caught 7 crows in 2006. All the crows that we caught were banded with a unique combination of bands on their legs. That way we can keep track of, okay, that's the one that we've caught, we haven't caught that one. And we can figure out, okay, who's calling, who's not. We tested their responses to these masks by wearing either no mask at all, the neutral Cheney mask, or the scary caveman with hat. And we wore them before we caught crows, and they didn't seem to care. But then we wore them after we caught the crows, and I'll show you what we found in just a minute. We also switched up the masks. We have the scary caveman mask, but without a hat. We had the hat, but without the mask. And finally, we had the caveman mask, but we flipped it upside down, just to see, can they really tell who we are, or are they just fixed on a specific image? And we measured their responses by counting how often a bird scolded and how often a mob of birds formed as a result of those scolds. Let me show you what we found. So before we caught any crows, only about 5% of the birds that we encountered scolded us, which is, I think, within just random error. But after we captured crows, we have feedback. No mask at all stayed exactly the same. The Cheney mask was mobbed a little bit more, just a little bit. But the scary mask with the hat, suddenly about 35 to 40% of the birds that we encountered are mobbing us. And what's more, if you look, the dangerous mask by itself mobbed almost as much. The dangerous mask that was upside down mobbed almost as much. In fact, funny story, the crows would actually turn their heads upside down before they started scolding us, just to make sure that, wait, I know you. But here's something interesting. The hat by itself, the crows recognized it and they did scold it, but only about half as many crows scolded the hat as they did the hat with the person or with the correct face. So they really are going after the identity of your face and not just the clothes you're wearing.
What was your thinking behind the no mask? Did it really change?
Well, the no mask, they know who caught them. They realized, okay, I don't have any problem with you. You didn't do anything terrible to me. The Cheney mask, was that what you were asking? The Cheney mask is slightly elevated?
So the no mask guy on the post capture was a different human being than no mask on the pre-capture? Or the same person?
Oh, the same person. We had multiple volunteers walk around without a mask, and then they counted what the crows did just before and after capture. Then they duck into a building, put a mask on, and go around and do the same thing. I can feel I haven't answered your question, but if you want, you can always come up to me afterwards and talk. So they can learn to recognize an extraordinary face. But I don't know about you guys, but I've not met a single person who actually looks like this poor caveman. What about an average, ordinary face? We had these custom latex masks made for us out of real people's faces, and we used them instead of the caveman. Same basic deal. We went out to different locations all across Seattle. We did the same setup as Experiment 1, only instead of a caveman mask, we had one of 6 different masks. This is starting on the top left and moving clockwise. We have Linda, Vivian, Michelle, Scott, Joe, and Hero. Now, I get it. People are very unnerved by these masks, but the crows didn't seem to care. They treated them just like they would a regular person. And I think I actually covered this already. We went out to different sites across Seattle. There's a different scary mask for every single site, just to make sure that we didn't just end up with one really scary mask for some reason. And we went out and caught crows with the mask on, came out later, and saw what they did. And here's what we found. Now, this graph's a little bit harder to read, I'll go into it real quick. This line represents the average stole rate before we caught them. The black bar is the scary mask. So, like for example, we have Scott, how much was Scott mobbed at each site, and here Scott was a dangerous mask. So we have how many birds stolen and how often a mob formed. Now, a lot of birds stole the masks. We think that was just because they were more nervous and they could tell something was a little bit off with that person's face because latex has different hues than a human face does. However, whenever they stole it, only the scary mask actually attracted a large group of crows. And Kaeli will go into this in a bit more detail about how birds use scolding to learn, but what I think is happening is we have an upset bird. He starts scolding. We mark that. Other birds fly up, and they see, oh, I don't recognize that guy, and they fly away, except for the dangerous mask. They see that dangerous mask, they stay, they scold, and they make a big deal about it. And they don't even seem to forget either. We've tested these masks annually since 2007. Every single year, they scold the caveman, and they, for the most part, ignore Cheney. I know, it's the opposite of what you would expect from a person. And we've even done brain scans on this. We've caught crows wearing the scary masks. We've housed them in an aviary, and every day someone would come in with a different mask, a neutral or a food-associated mask to feed them. And then we put them into a cage at a pet facility on the University of Washington. We'd given an injection of FDG, which shows up in a PET scanner, and we'd actually put them through a PET scan process after we let them see either the scary mask or the caring mask. And it activates different parts of the brain. When they see the scary mask, it actually activates the fear response. And when they see the caring mask, it activates the areas of the brain associated with food. So they really are connecting faces with events. Cause and effect, as Kaeli said. Yeah?
The scary mask and the caring mask, they treat the crow the same.
Oh no, well, okay, in this standing room, all they did was we had two people with the mask on, either two carrying masks or two staring masks, and they just sat there, didn't do anything. So yes, in the standing room, they treated the crow the same. However, when we caught the crows, we caught them wearing one mask, mask A, and we took care of them wearing a different mask, mask B. And we actually switched them with two different groups. So one group's scary mask was Linda, and the next group's scary mask was Greg. And in each case, the appropriate mask showed up as the appropriate response in their brain. So I've talked about facial recognition quite a bit. Let me wrap this up and move on to other studies. We know that crows recognize faces. It does not matter what you wear, how tall you are, how big you are, what clothes you're wearing. If you're wearing a mask that they recognize, they'll treat you as that same person. They're cueing in on your face. And there's different, what am I thinking of? There's different messages you can take away from this. If you want to get some friends with crows, all you have to do is feed them. You feed them on a regular basis, as Kaeli mentioned, they will remember you. They'll follow you around, and they'll wait for you wherever they associate you with feeding them. So if you're feeding them at your home, they'll actually look in your window, look for you, and tap, hey, I want some food. But if you're ever associated with something bad for a crow, that's not good for you. They'll call their friends, they'll harass and scold you, and they will just make your life miserable. So don't ever do anything to make a crow angry, because they will remember. All right, that's human facial recognition. Now let me talk about how they actually use cues of our face to judge intentions. And specifically, I'm going to talk about how they really, really don't like gaze. And I need to clarify this right now. I'm talking about gaze. So crows pay a lot of attention to people. It's just in their genome. They've cohabitated with people for millions of years. But people can be both good and bad. We can feed them, we can hunt them, they can ignore us, they might not want to ignore us. How can they tell if we mean them harm? Now, for example, how many of you have gone, say, to the city, Seattle, where it's really crowded, you walked along with a bunch of people, and you see a crow just foraging on the sidewalk, 2 or 3 feet away from this mass of people, and they're just ignoring everybody? And yet, you get curious, you go, hey, why is that crow not flying away? And all of a sudden, he notices you and he flies off. So why exactly did he ignore all those people who didn't care about him, but suddenly he, wait a minute, this guy, and then he flies away? That's what this experiment's going to address. So we do know that animals pay attention to gaze, and we know that they pay attention to expressions. So like primates, dogs, hoofed animals, birds, and even lizards can recognize when people are staring at them. And most of those same animals, plus, well, also sheep and pigeons, they can even distinguish between different facial expressions. And I thought this was really neat because they found that sheep prefer smiling faces to frowning faces. So, I mean, I'm biased, I like crows. If sheep can do it, surely crows can do that as well. So one of our postdocs, Dr. Barbara Klukas, created a study where she tested whether or not crows judge our intentions using gaze and or expression. And she picked 3 different sites in Seattle. There's that's Ravenna, which is a suburban, kind of a secluded neighborhood. You have Capitol Hill, which is much more crowded, and then you have University of Washington campus, which gets a lot of foot traffic. And she chose these sites because people exist in all of them, and so do crows, but they get very different amounts of foot traffic. That sounds alarming. So here's what she did. She would go out to these sites with a helper, and she'd find a crow, and she'd start walking towards that crow. And she would do it so that if the crow didn't move, she'd pass about 1 meter away from it. She'd keep facing straight ahead, but for half of them, she'd look straight ahead, and for the other half, she'd stare at the crow as she's walking past. Her assistant would use a laser rangefinder and would measure at what distance away the crow looked up and noticed her, and at what distance it actually moved away. And they also categorized how urgent its movement away was. So for example, if it just walked out of the way, that's low urgency. If it hopped or ran, that's moderate urgency. And if it flew away, that's high urgency escape. Let's show what we found. So for both cases, whether she's looking at the crow or not looking at the crow noticed it on average around 12 meters away. When she did not look at the crow, when she averted her eyes, the crow waited until she was about 3-4 meters before it moved out of the way. But when she stared at it, it moved away when she was only 8-7 meters away. So they're moving away more quickly when you're looking at them. And what's more, they moved away with greater urgency. So for the direct gaze, most all of them flew away. Whereas when she was ignoring them, averting her gaze, there's a mixture. Some walked out of the way, some hopped out of the way, some flew out of the way, but they really responded with urgency when she was staring at them. But what about expression? So she set up a second experiment, same as the first, but this time she changed her expression. She would either smile while looking straight ahead or looking at them, or she would frown while doing that. Now this graph's a bit more complicated, but these two are when she's averted her gaze, smiling or scowling, and these two are when she's directed her gaze, again, smiling or scowling. And what she found was there's really no difference. The crows responded the same whether she was frowning or smiling, but they did respond according to whether or not she was looking at them. So why might that be? Why would crows ignore our expression? We know that crows can recognize faces, and we know that pigeons can recognize expressions, so it stands to reason that crows actually recognize the different expressions, but why don't they care about them? Any takers? Who do you think, why do you guys think that crows don't pay attention to our expression, but they do what we're looking at?
Because they care whether or not we as a predator is after them, and they don't care about any of this other stuff.
Yeah, that's a big one. That's a big one. Our lab thinks that that is one of 2 major explanations, the other of which is that it's really easy to lie. It's not reliable. It's easy for you to fake a smile. It doesn't really matter what your expression is, but if your intention is that crow, it's really hard to avoid looking at it. Most predators fix their eyes, as you said, on their prey, and crows pick up on that. So because if a crow misjudges our intentions, it could cost it its life. So it has to focus on only the most reliable cue. And the most reliable cue of our intentions is our gaze, not our expression. So that's what crows know about our identities and our faces. Let's talk about what they know about other local predators. So Kaeli's going to go into this in more detail. I'm going to give you a very short crash course. Crows mob dangerous predators. That's where they gather in large groups and they harass it. They'll dive bomb it, they'll scream at it, they'll scold it, they'll swoop over it. They'll just do whatever they can to make that predator go away. And if they can't make it go away, they will at least make other crows aware of its presence to kind of neutralize its surprise and make it go away. I lost my train of thought there. We do know that larger mobs form around more dangerous predators. That's not necessarily true with other birds, but with crows it is. If you have a very dangerous predator, there's going to be a lot of crows that stay and mob it for a long time. Now, mobbing is costly. Sometimes the creature that they're mobbing can reach up and grab a crow that's dive bombing and kill it. It's also costly. Any time spent mobbing is time not spent defending a territory, foraging for food, and it requires energy. Swoop and dive and call and scream. So the crows have to balance. Is it worth it to mob this predator? And since we know that mobbing is something that's learned and educational, there's going to be some variation in how the crows respond to different predators in different areas. And again, Kaeli will go into this in much greater detail than I will. Now let me introduce you to this guy. This is an osprey. How many of you have seen and know what an osprey is? Excellent. I like that. It's a bird lovers class. So they're birds of prey. They look just like, well, they look similar enough to a hawk that some people can't tell them apart. I don't talk to those people. John noticed that they're rarely mobbed by crows. And when the crows do mob osprey, they seem to be mobbing them with the intention of stealing their fish, not driving them away. How do those crows know that osprey are not dangerous? I mean, it seems like that'd be a very costly mistake to assume, oh, that guy's not gonna, don't worry about that guy. That has to be a learned behavior. Now, John and one of our PhD students, a man named Jack DeLapp, set out to figure out whether this is actually a measurable phenomenon or if it's just them falling victim to confirmation bias. So they went out and enlisted an army of volunteers to go out all across Washington, find crows, and measure how do they respond whenever a bird of prey comes near. And they paid specific attention to 3 different birds of prey. We have the osprey, the bald eagle, and the red-tailed hawk. Now, these birds all represent different amounts of threat and risk to a crow. An osprey is no risk to mob. I mean, at the very least, it might swat at them and get them to go away, but other than that, it's very low risk. A bald eagle will eat adult crows, but crows aren't their main diet, and they're very big and kind of clumsy. They're not agile enough to pose a gigantic threat to a mobbing crow. So a bald eagle is a moderate mobbing risk. But a red-tailed hawk is very dangerous. Red-tailed hawks regularly and often catch and eat adult crows. And even when crows are mobbing them, sometimes these hawks are agile enough that they can swoop around and hook one with their talons. So the red-tailed hawk represents a high-risk target. So here's what they found. Out of all the observations, 12 of the crows encountered an osprey, 9 of them found a bald eagle, and 8 of them encountered a red-tailed hawk. Now, of those 12 crows that found the osprey, only 1 mobbed it. Compare that to the bald eagle and the red-tailed hawk. 7 out of 9 times the crows mobbed the bald eagle, and 6 out of 8 times the crows mobbed the red-tailed hawk. There is something happening here. So we know that wherever osprey occur, the crows ignore them. But what about the crows that have never seen an osprey before? So John and Jack selected a bunch of sites across Seattle and western Washington, and they categorized them. Does this place have osprey living nearby, or does it not have osprey living here? And then they would present these crows with one of 2 things, either a taxidermized osprey or a red-tailed hawk, and they would measure how often those crows would mob them. And here's what they found. wherever osprey occurred, the crows would not mob them very much. Only 40% of the crows mobbed the osprey where they were already occurring. But whenever the crows had never seen an osprey before, they mobbed them just as much as they would a red-tailed hawk. Better safe than sorry. So what we now know is that these crows consider osprey a threat until they learn better. Whenever they would start calling to bring in a mob, experienced birds would fly up, say, "Oh, that's an osprey," and they'd fly away without calling. And that appears to be a learning experience for the naive crow that's trying to call in a mob. Alternatively, when the crow calls in birds and it's a red-tailed hawk, and those birds freak out and join the mob, that's also educational. And did I mention everything? I think I did. Yeah. Okay. That's a lot for now. I'm about to launch into my own research, but I think it's time for a break.
Take a 10-minute break. I do have a little special treat that I'm going to bring out from the freezer, and it's not ice cream.
So I'm going to start talking about the research that I'm working on currently as a master's student. So my project is focusing on why do crows call around food? So a bit of background information. I used to feed the crows on campus at UW until John made me stop. And I noticed that whenever I toss a peanut to a crow on the ground, it would hop over and get it silently, just like you'd expect. But then all the birds around that saw me do this would fly towards me, and they start calling. Now I get why they're flying towards me, they want to be fed too, but why start calling? It seemed like those calls were attracting even more crows to the area, and if anything, that would just increase the competition for food. Didn't really make sense to me. When scientists find a behavior that doesn't really provide an obvious benefit to the actor, they call that behavior a Darwinian puzzle. Because why do this if it actually hinders you or hurts you? Now, even though the benefit wasn't obvious, it had to exist. Theoretically, calling around food has to provide some sort of benefit to that crow, otherwise that behavior would go extinct after a few generations. And the purpose of my master's work is to figure out why. So I came up with 4 different hypotheses for why crows would want to call around food. Maybe they're calling to recruit family members who don't know about the food. Now that would provide a definite benefit. If they're keeping their mate or their kids healthy, that would help them pass on their genes. Maybe those calls are to assert dominance and chase away all the intruders who are on their territory because they want that food. Makes sense as well. I mean, if they monopolize the food source, they get more of it. Or perhaps they're calling to the feeder, the person who's feeding them. We know that crows will, if they recognize a person who is helpful, they'll actually fly close by, get the person's attention. They'll even, as Kaeli mentioned, fly down and bonk you on the head in a friendly way. So they do try to communicate with people. Are those calls part of that same behavior? Or finally, maybe these calls are completely given at random and I've just tricked myself into thinking that something special is going on. And that actually happens to scientists, by the way. It's called confirmation bias, and I have to make sure that that's not what's happening in this situation. So in order to start this experiment, I needed to measure the crow's calls. So I got a hold of a high-quality audio recorder and a parabolic mic, which would allow me to record the different audio calls that they gave at a distance without disturbing them. I also had to make sure that the crows wouldn't recognize me when I came back to a site multiple times. Now, I didn't really want to use the latex mask because I didn't really have the cops calling me multiple times. Kaeli can attest that that happens more often than we would like to advertise. So I went for a bit more innocuous disguises. The point wasn't to make them recognize a specific person. I just didn't want them to realize, oh, it's that guy again. So I would just change the disguise and hopefully they wouldn't realize it was the same person. So I'd find the crows at a site and I'd record the calls and behavior that they did for 3 minutes. Then I'd toss out some food and record the calls they gave while there was food out. And then finally, when they'd eaten all the food, I'd continue recording for 5 minutes past the last peanut being eaten. That way I've got measures of the calls they gave before, during, and after they found food. This experiment by itself would tell me whether or not I was suffering from confirmation bias or whether they really did have unique calls when they found food. Now, another hypothesis that I had to address was whether they were directing their calls towards me, the feeder. So for some of the sites, rather than have a person, that'd be me, feeding the crows, I would just leave the food out for them to find. I had to get up before the sun rose, before the crows woke up, and leave food at a spot where I knew crows would visit, and wait. And eventually the crows would wake up, they'd find the food, I'd record their calls when they found it and ate it, and I'd record for 5 minutes afterwards. By comparing these two, I could figure out, okay, maybe they have a special call used for a person that they don't give when there isn't a person here. So that just leaves two hypotheses that have to be addressed. Are they recruiting family, or are they asserting dominance? And these hypotheses are no way mutually exclusive. It could be all three of them, or all four of them for that matter. Well, that last one's mutually exclusive. Don't worry about that last one. I think something's happening here. So ideally, I would need to be able to keep track of individual crows so I could figure out, okay, this crow called and this one came in and that one's a neighbor, or that one's a mate. Unfortunately, it's just not feasible for me to catch and band all the crows at all the sites all across Seattle. For one, it would take too much time, it would cost too much money, and also whenever we banded crows, they'd be nervous around people for a few days after that, and I didn't want that. So I settled on a roundabout method to figure out, are they bringing in family, or are they chasing away intruders? I reasoned that if a crow's goal is to attract family members to share the food, then the crow should really only call when there's enough food for them to share, and when it's by itself. So that meant that if I changed the amount of food I offered them, I could start to address this hypothesis. Now, if on the other hand, their calls were to chase away intruders or to assert dominance, then they should call whenever another crow flies in, or when there's already a lot of crows at the site, no matter how many peanuts there were. So if I kept track of how many birds there were, and when new birds arrived, I could tease out this information. So, to reiterate, there were two things I could change for each experiment. I could change how many peanuts I offered the crow, and I could change whether or not I fed them or they found it early in the morning. For every site, I would record the calls I gave and also keep track of how many birds there were at any given period of time. Now, before I go any further, I want to let you know that this is a work in progress. I'm still trying to figure out all this data, and I don't have any conclusions to give you. Hopefully I will. I better by the end of the year, or John will let me graduate. But I do have a list of predictions, so I'll go over them with you now. If I find the crows are calling more around a person, or if they have a very unique call that they give around a person, that would suggest that they're calling towards the person. They want the person to feed them. If they're only calling when there's one or maybe two birds, and if there's lots of peanuts, that's probably because they want to bring in family members. And if they only call whenever whenever a bird flies in, or if there's already a lot of crows at the site, that's probably territorial or dominance related. And by comparing the calls that the crows give with the situation that they were in when they gave those calls, I'm hoping I'll be able to connect the meaning behind each specific call type in each situation. Okay, that's what I'm doing. I've covered all my stuff. I'm going to switch back over to Kaeli, and she's going to talk about the work that she's done.
So I know this looks goofy, but just hang in there. So Loma talked to you a little bit already about scolding and mobbing. I think he actually did a very good job covering it. So the main take-home messages are scolding is a particular call that they emit when they are scolding something. It's like an alarm call. And mobbing, at least in our research in our lab, we define as basically when there's at least 3 adult birds all participating in that act of scolding. So I'm going to go into that in just a second, but I want to start with this video. And what you're going to see here is what happens when you send a person out holding a dead crow. Probably. So we can see he's kind of sitting right there behind the truck. They've got one of those masks on that Loma showed you earlier, and they're just holding a dead crow, a dead adult. And we've got a very clear mob, right? We've got a bunch of birds, and they're all emitting that scold call. And this is not uncommon. In fact, have any of you had this experience? Maybe you've seen a dead crow or raven. Have you ever seen that and seen how the birds react? Is this an experience? So some of you have. And many people, in fact some surprising people, folks like the people that repair power lines, they totally know about this because it's not uncommon that crows get electrocuted and they show up to make the repairs caused by that electrocution. Oftentimes the transformers have been damaged, and they'll see these big mobs. So the fact that crows responded to this, that wasn't that interesting. We wanted to know why. That's the really interesting thing. So maybe there's just no function, it's totally random, but that seems really unlikely. Like I said, this had been observed anecdotally many, many times. Maybe it's a social opportunity. So perhaps it's a time for them to say, well, Joe kicked the bucket, where's Nancy? Because now she's free. And where might we move up in the hierarchy? So maybe it's an opportunity for these, what we know are very social animals, to get together and do some reevaluating. Maybe it's grief. So they're expressing a very human emotion, so to speak, of mourning for this individual that they knew and has died. And it's an expression of a deep emotional sense of moving after this event. Grief is a really interesting explanation, but it's one that's immensely difficult to actually test in a rigorous way. So what I wanted to look at is if it was risk learning. So might this be an opportunity for them to learn about danger? So like Loma pointed out earlier, we know that they can. The osprey example is a great one. Clearly they are using experiences to learn when things are dangerous versus when they're benign. So just as a quick background, corvids are certainly not the only animals that seem to have these very ritualized, stereotyped responses to dead conspecifics. And conspecific means member of your own species. So we see this behavior in dolphins. This is a mother she's got her dead calf wrapped around her dorsal fin, actually. She carried that calf around for 2 days. And that's not uncommon. We see there's been spontaneous observations by dolphin researchers of wild dolphins trying to bring dead dolphins to the surface, carrying them around. They also do some other things. They'll attack them, they'll try and mate with them. So how they're responding, it's not this really clean, nice narrative that we would like necessarily. Elephants are a really well-known example, and I think one of the reasons they stand out so much is elephants are sensitive to their dead even to when they've been reduced to bones. So they've done experiments where we set out elephant bones versus other large mammal bones so that they'd be comparable in size, and elephants spend a significant more time around the elephant bones than they do the other kinds of animals. So they know, and what they might be getting out of this experience is totally a mystery, but they spend a lot of time around both dying individuals, and then if they happen to walk up to the bones of a deceased, they'll spend some time handling it, standing around it before they move on. Primates, of course, are another good example, and like dolphins, they do a lot of sort of what feels like mixed things. So sometimes they'll groom them, which is a very sort of nurturing, loving behavior, but they also will attack them, they'll rip them up. Mother primates, there's been a number of instances in a variety of primate species, from mountain gorillas to chimpanzees, will often, like dolphins, carry around their infants for months, it can be, and why they do that, and sometimes it's not even the mother, it might be a sister or completely unrelated female. So maybe it's a way that they sort of practice motherhood, they're just trying to practice what it would be like to cart this infant around. But the sort of main message is there's a variety of animals that seem to respond to their dead in a way that's unique, and it's not clear exactly what they're getting out of that experience. So a group out of UC Davis wanted to look at this behavior in scrub jays, western scrub jays, not a corvid we have out here, but you see them, we get more of them actually in Seattle. You can see them if you go to like the Ballard area, but they're really common south, so Oregon, they're all over the place. And they do this similar, they have a response to their dead, kind of like the crow video, where basically what happens is when they find a dead jay, they emit a call, and then other birds gather, and they all participate in that calling. And so they did a variety of experiments to try and get at what this might be for. And they, like myself, and they did this research first, were looking at danger learning. And they were able to elucidate a number of key things. So the first, if they put out something that looked vaguely similar to a dead jay, so a blue brick with some like blue popsicle sticks around it, jays didn't pay attention to that. So this is, they do know a jay from any other sort of similar looking object. If they put a dead jay out versus an owl, the response was very similar, so that inspired them to suggest that this may be a form of sort of anti-predator behavior. And then lastly, and this is key because we didn't test this in our study, we were sort of relying on this foundation, is that if they put out a dead jay versus an upright mounted jay, so a stuffed jay but it looked alive, there was a very clear difference. So whereas with the dead jay, they would come in and scold and recruit, with the what looked like an upright live jay, they dive bomb it. And that was a really important finding because it tells us that they recognize the difference between a dead jay and a live jay, and how they're responding to the dead jay is not a function of basically getting an invader out of your territory. So that's really important. So going into that, when I wanted to do this experiment on crows, I had sort of three big picture questions. So the first was, do American crows respond to crows with risk-reducing behaviors? And that was the way that I was going to test danger learning. So I'll go into the specifics of what that looked like here in a minute. The second was, are dead crows used to infer novel predators? So one thing that we got all the time, emails and questions, is, I found this dead crow in my yard, and I picked it up to move it, and now the crows won't stop harassing me. What is happening? And so we wanted to know, maybe the reason that they pay such close attention to this event and that they mob is it's a way that they learn about new predators. And the last thing I wanted to know is the response to different dangers uniform? So if you're hiking out in the woods and you see a bear, that is probably pretty scary. And if you're hiking in the woods and you see a dead person, that's also very scary. But those are very different things, right? There's a lot of extra baggage when you see a human being, and the sort of imminentness of that danger is potentially really different. Like if you see a person, you're going, oh my gosh, what happened? How can I avoid the same fate? But there's, versus a bear, a predator, I think we can all recognize that there's nuance there, right? Those dangers are not the same. So I wanted to sort of look at the same thing with crows. If a dead crow is indicative of danger, if I can measure that, is it going to be the same as something like a red-tailed hawk? So to test this, I had 5 different stimuli. So my volunteers all wore those masks that Loma had showed us previously, which meant that when I finally published this research and it started to sweep through social media, my research was wonderfully crowned the most terrifying scientific experiment in the history of science. Because I had these people in these masks holding dead crows. I don't think it's that scary, but maybe I'm just a little bit too desensitized. But basically, the 5 different stimuli is I would just have a person holding a dead crow, like you might hold an hors d'oeuvre tray. The key thing there is they're not being rough with the crow. The idea was not that they were looking like they were killing it. It was just that they had it in their hands. And then in all of these different stimuli, there's always a pile of food, and the function of that will be very clear in a minute. Then in another one, I have a person, now they don't have a crow, but they're near that other kind of danger, and that's the red-tailed hawk. So I now have a predator, and it's sort of vaguely associated with this person. They're not directly interacting, but they're close. Then in my next one, I have a dead crow with that hawk, so now we're very clearly sending a different message about how that crow died. In the first one, a crow could potentially infer that a human killed it, and in this one, they'll probably infer that that hawk killed it. And again, this person, they're there, but they're not interacting with any of this. And then of course I had 2 controls, so we needed to make sure, as in the first facial recognition study, that they weren't just inherently terrified of these masks, as human beings are. And then we had no other stimulus besides just the food. And so basically what I did is I went throughout Seattle and the east side, and I would, so for each of those different stimuli, the 5 different stimuli, there were 2 different experiment types. So in total, there was 9 experiments that I did. So at each one of these sites, each one of these orange polygons, there were between 9 and 7 distinct territorial pairs. And all you have to take away from this is that each pair of birds got a unique stimulus and they didn't participate in any other experiments. So we considered every experiment independent. That's all that you have to pay attention to here. So here's what the actual experiment looks like. So the first thing was to establish a feeding site. And that meant that I had to identify a territorial pair. And in the summertime, that's really easy because you just got to find where the nests are. Because if they're nesting, then you've got a pair. So we would go out and find a territorial pair, and then we would start feeding them for 3 days. And provided, and our secret combo of food, it took many iterations for me to get this right, is raw unshelled peanuts and Cheetos. Because it turns out, if you try and feed only peanuts to crows in downtown Seattle, they will cooperate for the first day, and then they go, I don't really care about your peanuts, lady. There's like some McDonald's hamburgers down the street, so I'm not going to cooperate with you. And so the Cheetos, that's how I sort of got the edge on them so that they'd cooperate. So for those first 3 days, I would just go out and I'd put food down and I'd measure how long it would take them to come down to the food. And the function of that, remember, what I'm looking at is danger learning. And I'm looking at 2 things. One, are they learning about the place? Are they learning that the place is dangerous? So the way I was going to measure that is, if I've been feeding them and know that it takes, on average, 1 minute for them to come down to the food, and then this scary thing happens on day 4, and then I keep feeding them, am I going to see that the average time it takes them to come down to that food has changed after they saw that scary thing? And then the second, and I'll go into this more later, is the person. So again, for those first 3 days, I just put food out, and then on the 4th day, they saw one of those experiments. So maybe they saw somebody holding a dead crow, maybe they just got a control, maybe they got somebody with a hawk. So food, and then stimulus. So now I'm going to go over, because remember, one of my questions was, are those dangers nuanced? Are they responding to them differently, or are they uniform? So I'm going to go over the results now before I move on with the rest of the experiment. So this shows the percent that mobbed. Again, that's at least 3 adult birds scolding. And so we can see just the crow, the hawk with crow, hawk, and then our controls. And the key takeaway message here is it was not by a significant majority, but the largest one was hawk and crow. So if they saw both the hawk with the crow and a human being standing there, more of them mobbed than when they saw these other 2 dangers. And conveniently enough, they did not do that when they saw control. So good, they're not just automatically terrified of the masks, and this isn't just something that they're doing at random. So the other thing I looked at, the reason why I would have to stand in downtown Seattle for 4 to 5 hours doing these experiments, is I wanted to say, okay, after we get rid of that stimulus, if I wait for 2.5 hours, will the crows come back? Or will they just, are they out of there? Are they so traumatized that they're just out of there? And again, the take-home message here is we saw the same pattern that we did with mobbing, where they were much more likely, and this was significant, to avoid if they saw the hawk with the dead crow and the human being. So in answer to our question, are these dangers uniform? It seems very clear that the answer is no. So they will treat, depending on context, and we know that birds, especially crows, are very sensitive to the context of a predator, if they're with or without prey, if they're hunting or not. And that was borne out by this study as well. And the other really interesting thing is that they were temporally sensitive. So as the study progressed, these differences that we saw in how they responded immediately when the predator was actually present, those did not continue through the rest of the study. And what I mean by that will be clear in just a minute. So now we've gone through these 4 days. So the last part of the experiment was to just keep, in the case of this first trial type, and I know this gets a little bit dense, so feel free to ask me questions if something gets confusing. But basically for the last 3 days in the first experiment type, we just kept feeding. So it looked identical to these first 3 days. And again, the question there, so they saw something, food. The question there is, are we going to see a difference in the average time it took them to come down to the food between these 3 days and those 3 days? And this was the answer. Yes, we did. So we saw a similar, so these striped bars are the preconditioning, so those first 3 days, and the solid gray are the post-conditioning. And in both cases, we see an increase. For some reason, it does just in general. They sort of slow down as the week progresses. But it was significantly slower if they had seen something scary. And so what that means is, in answer to the question, are crows using these funeral experiences to learn that a place is dangerous and changing their behavior subsequently? Yes. Yes?
So it looks like the absolute numbers are really quite different if you use a log scale, so I'm kind of confused if the graph actually makes a difference if one's smaller than it was.
Yeah, so when we sat down to do the statistics, we found that when we just ran these as regular whole numbers, it was not behaving normally. So we had to transform the data. That's why it's in a log scale. But the change in food time reported in a log is pretty meaningless to people. So we included it here, the actual amount of time, just because that sort of is more meaningful as you're reading this data. So in order for the stats to be right, we had to transform it, and it was. But just as a just so you know, this is how it played out in reality, the change, it is pretty big, yeah. So, and when the first time, so I did this over 2 field seasons, the first time I ran the data, I was so excited. It was so significantly different. I was like, yes, I'm not gonna have to do another field season. And then the statistician was like, your data's not normal, you have to transform it, and when we did, it was not significant anymore. So then I had to do another field season. So anyways, yeah. So then, to just add on more stuff to this study, we also did this second trial time, where for these last 3 days, instead of just feeding them, we also had the person that they saw participate in that dangerous experiment just standing there. So if that's Vivian, yes, it is. So if Vivian had been out there with her dead crow on day 4, now she's just hanging out. She's not doing anything scary, she's just there. So in this test, we're looking at, again, is their reaction to the food going to have changed? But also, how are they going to respond to this person? Is the reaction going to be different because it's sort of being reinforced by the continued presence of this person? And we see a much bigger difference. Yeah, so again, it's significant. The average time it took them to come down to the food during those first 3 days versus those last 3 days was significantly different. But you can just see in the numbers here, it's a bigger amount of time too. And we saw a smaller difference with the control for whatever reason. That's just sort of random crow behavior. So, in terms of the implications of these results, basically crows use dead crows as an indication of danger akin to predators, and that influences their spatial use. And that makes pretty intuitive sense, right? If you see a dead crow near food, you don't necessarily want to go to that food. Now, I want to be very careful and clear. It wasn't, which I hope it was clear in the graphs, this was not an outright avoidance. That would have been great. It would have been really powerful. It was just that it would take them longer. So what this graphic is sort of showing you is a dead crow doesn't make them leave forever, but it makes them really nervous and wary. And basically what we would see is during those first 3 days when we throw our cheetahs out, they would just sort of march up to the food. And then after we did this experiment, they would be like, and then they would run away. So there was this very clear change in their behavior, but it wasn't this outright avoidance. So the last part that we were testing was that predator learning part. So now I've addressed the whole spatial learning. Yes, they're using dead crows to learn that a place is dangerous, but what about that person? And so what we did here is, in trial type 1, food only, remember they haven't seen that person since that dangerous thing happened on day 4. In trial type 2, they have. They saw them every day. They weren't with anything. But in either case, they got what we called a longevity test 1 week after they had last seen the person. In the case of trial type 1, that 1 week happened after day 4, and in trial type 2, that 1 week happened after day 7, because it's just a week after they last saw the person. And what we found is during the first longevity test, one of the things we were interested in is if they'd seen that person repeatedly, was that going to make them less wary of them? So if anybody has ever done dog training where maybe you used a shock collar, and you shock the dog every time it barks. Well, what we find, and this is true with really any animal, is if you keep shocking it in the absence of that, you play a beep and then shock it, right? And that trains the dog to be like, uh-oh, beep, I should stop barking because I know it's coming. Now, if you keep playing that beep and it doesn't, it's not followed by a shock, they get habituated to it and they'll forget it. And in rats, that can happen even just after 1 exposure. So what we thought with these 2 different trial types is, if they kept seeing that dangerous person out there just standing around for those last 3 days with nothing dangerous, are they going to be like, nah, they're okay, faster than that other trial type, where they didn't see them again for a week? And the answer was no. There was no difference. They were just as wary in either case. And then the really interesting test was, we kept doing this for up to 6 weeks. So if the birds kept responding, if they kept scolding or mobbing or avoiding the food completely for 2.5 hours, how many of them would keep doing that for all 6 weeks? And it was about 38% of the crows that we tested. We had a sample size of 65, which is pretty gosh darn impressive, especially when you consider that some of those people were just standing near hawks. They're not actually directly involved in any of these dangerous things. And so the message of that is, crows are really paying attention to the things that you're doing. If you find a dead crow in your yard and your neighborhood crows spy you interacting with that, they are not going to forget about it. Even if you're just standing near a different kind of predator, they're learning your face. I mean, can you imagine the potential number of faces in a city that crows are learning? How many people in a given lifetime? And one of the questions we don't know is there sort of a saturation point? Maybe they can learn somebody holding a dead crow or who captured them, and it's like 5 people. Maybe not. Maybe it's 100. That's something that we really don't know the answer to yet. It's a really interesting question. So again, yeah, take home human proximity to different kinds of danger stimulates learning by crows. That was really impressive.
Kaeli,
Yes.
what about, how do you know that it's humans? What about other things that are associated with whatever the danger situation is?
So like context.
Context, or what if it's a dog?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I totally think that they probably learn dogs too. Like if you're walking your dog and it's breeding time and there's a fledgling on the ground, it goes after it. I would bet money that that crow would learn that both you and that dog are dangerous. We don't know the answer to that. Again, that's like I said at the top of the talk. So much of this behavior is really cool and we sort of can give a vague answer, and then when we press on the details we go, I don't know. Because these experiments take a long time and they're really hard.
So are your masked people all wearing the University of Washington sign?
They are. So that was not ideal because like Loma said, they're also recognizing, and thank you for reminding me of this, that was very necessary because otherwise the cops would come all the time and it was a huge distraction. But during the 5th longevity test, so the second to last one, we did an experiment where we would have the dangerous mask with the sign walk around their territory and a new mask with that sign walk around their territory, and significantly more of them responded to the dangerous mask than to a novel one. So even with the sign, that was probably helping them to know, but they still knew the face was more important in that recognition.
T-shirt that says, "I'm doing an experiment for UW."
I know. There are so many ways in retrospect I should have done things differently, but in the heat of the moment, it was just like, the cops are coming, somebody write a sign, and then we put the sign on, and then they were like, your sign looks handwritten and it's not convincing. So then we because, yeah, it's really just, life advice. It doesn't work so well when the police come and you go, you know what, sir, I'm in the middle of an experiment on birds and I need you to give me a minute, okay? They don't like that. So So yeah, you gotta sort of be prepared to handle them as soon as they come. And so one of the really interesting and valuable parts of this is this ability of them to recognize faces in association with dead individuals was not new to our lab. Because we had actually already tested, Loma talked a little bit about the PET scanning stuff earlier. We had already tested how a crow's brain responds when it sees a novel person holding a dead crow. And what's activated in that experience is the hippocampus, and that's what's associated with memory and spatial learning and all of that good stuff. And so really part of this experiment was just saying, we have lab evidence that their brain is responding this particular way, but we don't actually know if that's being carried out in the wild spontaneously. And so this research really supported the idea that yes, crows are using, when they see people with dead crows, they're learning their face, and now we've shown that both in the field and in the lab by looking in their brains, so to speak. So, in terms of future research, that forgiveness question is a great one. So one thing that would be so interesting, but John won't let us because he wants to keep testing how long this thing with the cavemen will persist, is what if the cavemen started feeding the crow? Would they stop scolding faster than if it didn't and just as time went on? Does the response last longer than 6 weeks? So that 6 weeks was a completely arbitrary, that was just the amount of time that I could handle doing these experiments. Conducting all of these, so I showed you those sites. So every day I was working all of those sites. So the field day, a typical field day, which was 7 days a week, was anywhere between 12 and 15 hours. And I did that for about 6 months. So a lot of gosh, why did you do it that way? It was because I was crazy. I was really tired and trying to do my best. What about pairing people with other dangerous things? So things like dogs, yeah. And then one thing that's not up here, but is the most relevant, because it's actually what I'm working on now, is how sensitive are they to different parts of this experiment? So the research I'm currently conducting is I'm getting rid of the food, I'm getting rid of the people, and I want to know, are they sensitive to something like age, for instance? So for the first about 4 years of a crow's life, the survivorship is bad. It's only about 50%. So in the summer months, you're seeing dead, especially in Seattle, you're seeing lots of dead baby crows all over the place. So we know that their sensitivity to these dead individuals is a function of danger learning. But a dead kid, that's pretty common. That doesn't tell you that much, right? Because they're dying for all kinds of reasons. So theoretically, they should be more sensitive to an adult because that's much more rare. After about those first 4 years, survivorship of adult crows is about 85%, actually. It's pretty hard to take out an adult crow. So that's one of the things we're looking at now, and then comparing non-breeding versus breeding season. Because maybe during the breeding season, they're way more hyped up, they're going to be more sensitive because they've got kids, there's more at stake, so to speak. So we're doing some experiments comparing how they respond to adults versus juveniles, and then if there's going to be any kind of seasonal difference. Now I'll end on, I think the last most interesting thing, and a really important caveat about this study is, in all of these cases, they're looking at dead crows that they don't know, right? And I started this talk by saying how social these birds are. So one of the things that we would really like to do is capture a mated pair, bring them into the lab, and then fake that one of them has died. So the really wonderful thing about the PET scanning technique that Loma explained is that we do not have to euthanize these animals. They actually get to go home at the end of these experiments. That's really rare in any kind of neurological study. It's a really cool thing our lab can do. So one of the things we want to know is, maybe they have this response, this danger learning response, but perhaps there's more going on there that we're not bearing out because it's just a random crow. So what would happen if we get that mated pair, we bring them into the lab, and we anesthetize one of them? So it looks dead, it's limp, right? And we bring its mate into the lab, we show it what looks like its dead mate, and then we run that through the PET scanner. Is the part of its brain that's activated different than if it's just a random crow? So there's a number of reasons why that's going to be difficult. But I think if we really want to understand the emotional lives of these animals, if we really want to understand that potential, that kind of question is going to be really key to addressing that. So it's not something that's on the books now. I think it would be super interesting. But like I said, that's sort of one of those, it's a fun thought experiment for now. So with that, I know I sort of sped through my research. I hope I didn't lose too many of you. But we're actually on time, pretty much, to answer questions. So why don't we open the floor, and happy to address anything after we get the floor. Yes?
Well, I'm just curious about the condition of your corpses. It seems to me you see a lot of dead birds around that are intact. And predators don't usually leave them intact. They keep them, and there's a pile of feathers. Have you thought about that?
I have. I think that would be so cool. Just sort of
repeat the question a little bit.
Oh, yes, I'll repeat it. So the question is, have we ever thought about how decomp, or the condition of the body when the birds encounter it, might change the response? And I have thought about that. I haven't tested it, but I think it would be really cool, like elephants, to look at, if it's just bones, do they recognize it at all? Do they respond to it? In terms of sort of speaking to how it might have died, because that's like a feather spot, that's what we call what you're describing, where it's just like a bunch of feathers around. I didn't want to do that for these current experiments, or the previous ones. We had, so they're intact, really nice looking birds, and part of that is we don't want to make clear what the cause of death was, because maybe if they know it was an avian predator, if it's a feather spot, they respond differently than if it was West Nile virus. So by just having an adult crow, that's sort of the best way that we can potentially leave that as esoteric as possible and sort of most open to interpretation by the crows. But I really think that that's a necessary sort of follow-up for sure. It's a great question.
The crow population is increasing in Seattle, and does this, any of the study correlate with breeding?
The question was, is the crow population increasing in Seattle, and is it correlated with ravens?
Yeah, I mean, can you correlate this also with breeding?
So the short answer to your question is kind of. So we know that many populations around the U.S. are responding to West Nile virus. So in some areas, places saw as much as a 50% decrease in populations, and so those are rebounding. In terms of Seattle, it is growing, but that's mostly, it's not because we have more and more crows filling the same amount of space. It's because crows love development. And we are developing parts of Seattle like crazy. And when you tear down forests, you make habitat for crows. So as long as we keep doing that, as long as we keep tearing down forests and developing urban areas, you're going to get more crows. Yeah, and I imagine, actually, I guess I won't venture an answer with the ravens because I really don't know, and I'd hate to leave you astray. Maybe.
So earlier when Kaeli was talking about how the crows roost in large roosts, ravens do the same thing. And she mentioned how one of John Marslow's first works was how ravens use roosts as mobile information centers. And we have not really found much of a correlation between that and crows because the situations are very different. Ravens in Maine in the winter subsist mostly on carcasses. So a deer or an elk dies and they have to go find it. And so it's necessary for them to rely on other ravens to tell them, where is this carcass, let's go get it. And the reason that they help each other is because ravens, like crows, are territorial. So you have vagrant Juby ravens and you have territorial adults. If a moose dies on an adult's territory, those two adults are going to monopolize it. The only chance that the juvenile vagrant ravens have is to gang up on those adults and just overwhelm them. But for ravens, yeah, small, concentrated food sources are located at random throughout the environment. With crows, they eat seeds, bugs, trash, just pretty much anything, and there's not much of a need for the information center hypothesis.